In 1041 AD, in the landlocked mountains of Sichuan, a team of Chinese workers did something that would not be repeated anywhere else on Earth for another 800 years. Using bamboo drill bits attached to massive stone derricks, they bored a hole nearly a kilometer straight down into the bedrock. What they were drilling for was not gold, not jade, not iron. It was brine, salty water trapped deep underground. When that pressurized liquid finally shot to the surface, they piped it through an elaborate network of bamboo tubes to evaporation pans, boiled it using natural gas they had tapped from the same wells, and produced the most valuable substance in the Chinese Empire. Not silk, not porcelain, salt. To understand why a common mineral could be worth more than precious metals, you need to understand one basic fact about pre-modern life. Before refrigeration, salt was the only reliable way to preserve food. Without it, meat rotted within days. Fish spoiled within hours. Vegetables could not survive a journey longer than a week. But salt was not just about preservation. The human body physically cannot function without sodium. Your nerves cannot fire. Your muscles cannot contract. Your heart cannot beat. In a civilization built on manual labor, where hundreds of millions of farmers, soldiers, and canal workers sweated through subtropical summers, the demand for dietary salt was not a luxury. It was a biological imperative. In a sprawling empire stretching from the frozen Manchurian steppe to the tropical coasts of Guangdong, the ability to feed armies, stock granaries, and keep millions of people alive through winter depended entirely on salt. Whoever controlled the supply of salt controlled the survival of the population. And the Chinese state understood this earlier than any civilization on Earth. As far back as the 7th century BC, the statesman Guanzhong advised the ruler of the state of Qi to monopolize salt production. His logic was devastatingly simple. Every single person, rich or poor, noble or peasant, needs salt to live. You cannot substitute it. You cannot grow it in your garden. If the state controls its production and sale, it creates a tax that is functionally invisible, embedded in the price of something no one can refuse to buy. Guanzhong called it a tax that people pay without knowing they are being taxed. The ruler of Qi followed his advice. Within a generation, the state of Qi became the wealthiest and most powerful of all the warring kingdoms. That model never died. For the next 2,000 years, every major Chinese dynasty adopted some version of the salt monopoly. The Han dynasty formalized it into a vast bureaucracy. The Tang dynasty used salt revenue to rebuild after the devastating Anlushan rebellion, a civil war that killed tens of millions. By the Song dynasty, salt taxes accounted for more than half of the imperial government's total income. Think about that for a moment. The largest, most sophisticated government in the medieval world funded more than half its operations, its armies, its canals, its bureaucracy, its border walls, with revenue from a single mineral. But the salt monopoly was not just an economic policy. It was a geographic force that physically reshaped the Chinese landscape. The locations where salt could be produced became, by definition, the most strategically important places in the empire. Along the northern coast, massive salt pans stretched for kilometers, shallow pools where seawater was left to evaporate under the sun. Entire cities, like Tianjin, grew from nothing into major urban centers simply because they sat at the intersection of salt production and river transport. Inland, the story was even more dramatic. In Sichuan, the city of Zigong became one of the wealthiest cities in China solely because of its deep brine wells. At its peak, Zigong operated over 10,000 salt wells and a bamboo pipeline network that carried brine from wellhead to evaporation furnace stretched for hundreds of kilometers across the mountainous terrain. It was, in many ways, the world's first industrial infrastructure. And the artery that connected all of this together was the Grand Canal. Most people know the Grand Canal as the longest artificial waterway ever built, stretching over 1,700 kilometers from Beijing to Hangzhou. What most people do not know is why it existed. The standard explanation is grain transport, moving rice from the fertile south to feed the political capital in the north. That is true, but it is only half the story. Salt moved along the Grand Canal in volumes that rivaled grain. Imagine a highway built primarily to transport a single product. That was effectively what the Grand Canal was for salt. The canal's elaborate lock systems, its army of maintenance workers, and the thousands of boats that traveled its length were sustained in large part by the salt trade. The government did not just use the canal to move salt. The salt trade helped justify the staggering cost of keeping the canal operational for centuries. Without salt revenue, maintaining the canal would have been like operating a modern interstate, with no toll income and no tax base. The waterway and the mineral were locked in a symbiosis that lasted over 1,000 years. This is where the story takes its most fascinating turn. Because the government could not manage every aspect of salt distribution across such an enormous territory, it created a licensing system. Private merchants were granted exclusive rights to buy salt from government-controlled production sites and sell it in designated regions. These licenses, called yin, were extraordinarily valuable. A single salt license could generate returns that would make a modern venture capitalist envious. Over the centuries, a new class of super merchants emerged, the Yangzhou salt merchants. Yangzhou, a city on the Grand Canal in Jiangsu province, became the hub of the salt distribution network and consequently one of the richest cities on the planet. The wealth of its salt merchants was legendary, and not in the way that word is usually used. These merchants were genuinely, almost absurdly rich. During the Qing dynasty, when the Emperor Qianlong made his famous southern inspection tours, it was the Yangzhou salt merchants, not the local governors, who financed the construction of temporary palaces, elaborate gardens, and theatrical performances for the imperial entourage. One merchant reportedly spent the modern equivalent of tens of millions of dollars on a single imperial visit, and considered it a routine cost of doing business. But the Yangzhou merchants did something far more lasting than simply accumulating wealth. They became the most extravagant patrons of art and culture in Chinese history outside the imperial court itself. They funded painters, poets, calligraphers, and scholars. The famous 8 eccentrics of Yangzhou, a group of painters who broke with orthodox artistic traditions, were supported almost entirely by salt money. The exquisite private gardens that still stand in Yangzhou today were built by salt merchants competing with each other to demonstrate the most refined taste. Yangzhou cuisine, famous for its delicate knife work and subtle flavors, was developed in the kitchens of salt merchant households, where private chefs were hired to create dishes that could impress visiting officials and rival merchants. A mineral pulled from the earth and the sea underwrote an entire golden age of Chinese art, yet the salt monopoly contained within it a deep and corrosive contradiction. The same system that funded the empire also oppressed the people it was built upon. Because the government set the price of salt artificially high to maximize revenue, millions of ordinary people could not afford enough of it. The official price of government salt was often 5 to 10 times the cost of production. For a peasant family spending most of their income on grain, the price of legal salt could consume what little remained. This created an enormous black market. Salt smuggling became one of the most common and most dangerous criminal enterprises in Chinese history. Smugglers operated vast underground networks, moving illegally produced salt across provincial borders using armed convoys. The penalties for salt smuggling were severe, often death, but the profits were so enormous that the trade never stopped. Some of these smugglers became powerful enough to topple dynasties. Huang Chao, who led one of the most destructive rebellions in Chinese history during the late Tang dynasty and sacked the imperial capital of Chang'an, began his career as a salt smuggler. He knew the underground trade routes, he knew the grievances of the poor, and he knew how to organize men outside the law. So did Fang Guozhen and Zhang Xicheng, warlords whose salt-smuggling armies helped bring down the Mongol Yuan dynasty and clear the path for the founding of the Ming. The substance that funded the empire also bred the men who destroyed it. And then there is the most invisible legacy of all, the one sitting on dinner tables across China right now. The uneven geography of salt production permanently shaped regional cuisines. In coastal provinces like Guangdong and Fujian, where salt was relatively abundant and cheap, cooking developed around the principle of preserving the natural flavor of fresh ingredients. Cantonese cuisine, famous for its steamed fish and light sauces, is a cuisine of salt confidence, the food of people who never had to worry about preservation. Move inland to Sichuan, Hunan, and Guizhou, where salt had to be transported over mountain passes at enormous cost, and the palate transforms completely. In these provinces, cooks turned to alternative preservation and flavoring methods. Chili peppers, which arrived from the Americas in the 16th century, were embraced with a passion unmatched in the coastal regions precisely because they offered intense flavor without the expense of salt. Vinegar became another weapon. In Guizhou, one of the poorest and most mountainous provinces, sour flavors from fermented rice water and pickled vegetables became a defining characteristic of the local cuisine, a way to make bland starches exciting when neither salt nor chilies were available in sufficient quantities. Fermented bean pastes, vinegar pickles, and smoked meats became the backbone of inland cuisine, each one a creative workaround for the simple problem of not having enough affordable salt. The famous dubanjiang of Sichuan, the fermented chili bean paste that is the soul of mapo tofu and twice-cooked pork, is, at its core, a technology for making food taste preserved and complex, without relying on large quantities of expensive salt. The fiery cuisines that tourists now travel thousands of miles to taste were not born from a love of heat. They were born from the economics of salt scarcity. Salt did not just flavor the food of the Chinese Empire. It funded its armies, built its cities, carved its waterways, and enriched its art. It created fortunes that rivaled emperors and bred rebellions that destroyed dynasties. And when the supply ran thin, it forced millions of cooks to improvise, inventing the very flavors that define Chinese regional cuisine today. A single mineral, pulled from wells drilled 1,000 years ago, is still shaping the taste of every meal. The empire is gone, the salt remains.